Okay, so I will begin with a brief outline of our webinar. We will first start with Simon's speech, which will last for around 40 minutes. Though seeing that we have 3 people, you can extend this to around 50 minutes if you would like, Simon. And after this concludes, we will spend the remainder of the time on a Q&A session. Due to the number of English-speaking participants and due to the lack of supplementary materials, we have elected not to provide on-the-spot translations in Vietnamese of Simon's speech, but we will have a translated summary of his speech on our page shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. As you can see, this webinar will also be recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in short order. Now, before we begin, we would like to request all participants to turn off their microphone throughout the session. If you have any questions, please type them out in the chat box. And now, please let me introduce our distinguished author and speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Simon Barber. Simon is currently a lecturer at Ōtākou Whakaihu Waka, University of Otago in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and he is a scholar of indigenous thought, politics, Marxist and critical theory, Black studies, and communism. Simon is also a researcher for economic and social research at Aotearoa and sits on the executive committee of the Māori Association of Social Sciences. He recently co-edited a special issue of New Zealand Sociology, and his works have appeared in journals such as Counter Futures and Journal of Sociology. We are very honored to have him here with us, and the stage is yours, Simon.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Hugh. It's very honored to be invited by the group to talk to you all today. I was recently in Ho Chi Minh City for a conference and had a chance to meet some people there, and really cool to start trying to the project that you have and some of the speakers that you've had as part of this. And I think it's great for us to start, keep developing these kind of international connections as much as we can. So I'll be talking today about an article I wrote some time ago now called Māori Mārx, some provisional materials. So this is to point to the fact that this kind of concept of Māori Mārx is provisional. It's a kind of speculative construction, and one that I hope is also or would need to become something more than provisional, a kind of collective construction, a kind of collective participation and imagining of this figure of a Māori Mārx. So the stakes really, or the kind of impetus of the argument is that we live in a time of increasingly likely sort of catastrophic kind of planetary ecological collapse. This is a kind of urgency in our moment and alarm. And so there's 2 tasks at hand that are both simultaneous with each other, they sort of occur at the same time. One, that we need to dismantle, destroy, abolish this kind of machinery of the Earth's desecration, impoverishment, destruction. So this is capitalism. This we see more and more the kind of fundamental irrationalities of the system that is sending us hurtling towards this kind of ecological kind of collapse. So the other task that's connected with this demands that we find new ways of relating to each other and to the Earth. So one part, abolishing capitalism and constructing new kind of social forms together. And it's my contention that a Māori Mārx has something kind of vital in the sense of being both crucial, important, as well as lively, filled with life to contribute to this task. So in trying to imagine this figure of a Māori Marx, there's kind of two directions that I do this from. The first is somewhat easier, I guess, but it's looking at Marx's own thought, his reading, his research, and his writings, his note taking in the last years of his life, where he develops a kind of profound interest in Indigenous societies. I should have said by way of introduction that I am Ngaitahu or Kaitahu, which is Māori people from Te Waipounamu, the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this is, yeah, in some senses my position in writing this. But so Marx develops this kind of profound interest in Indigenous societies towards the end of his life. So we can start sort of here, thinking alongside Marx, like what is the kind of trajectory of his thought that has taken him to this moment. Obviously, it's a radically kind of open-ended project for Marx because it's unfinished. It's often his kind of marginal works, his notations from his reading in this period. So here we can think alongside Marx as how he's approaching, how he is thinking Indigenous peoples in relationship to his own project. So this is kind of one or preliminary kind of Māori Marx, but I think to go kind of deeper than that, to develop a kind of thinking more adequate to this place here, Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the attempt to read Marx and rethink Marx from the perspective of some central concepts within Te Ao Māori, the Māori world. This onto epistemological, this kind of how the world has its being and becoming in Te Ao Māori, and the associated thought that arises from that world. So an attempt to read and rethink Marx from the perspective of these concepts. So it's important here just to note that Marx himself was always a kind of thinker of and in movement. He was constantly kind of reappraising his own thought, and especially with regards to peoples outside of capitalism, people at the kind of margins of capitalism. He was constantly kind of complexifying his understanding. A nice phrase from Theodore Shannon. He's particularly interested in the heterogeneity of structure and movement in the world. So there's different modes of life, different peoples that he's constantly kind of teaching himself about and learning about. He doesn't simply fit these into a pre-existing schema, but he allows this to kind of transform his own thinking and research. So as with kind of other schools and other perspectives, it's not simply that we can take Marx's writing as kind of scripture, and then things that he hasn't quite got to, then we sketch in parts of a pre-existing schema, but that the kind of spirit of Marx, we must be constantly kind of thinking for ourselves and rethinking from these different perspectives. And in terms of a kind of internationalism, it's this kind of heterogeneity of perspectives that we can bring, and that Marx is a useful guide, a kind of crucial guide for. That enables us to build up a kind of a full picture and to unlock a kind of planetary creative imagination of the types of transformations that are urgent. It opens us out from a kind of European set of concepts that remains kind of limited by this perspective into what Cedric Robinson has termed this kind of this kind of deeper sea of human liberatory endeavor. So it's a kind of enables us to enrich our radical struggles with other traditions of struggle, but for which Marx is an incredibly useful contribution. So we can think as an example maybe of the way in which social reproduction feminisms, rather than simply kind of adding a little piece on domestic labor or something to Marx's schema, involves something of a transformation of the thought as well, that these new these perspectives that shed life on different parts of the system enable us to kind of transform and enrich our thinking. So this here, Māori Marx is a very kind of provisional attempt to do this. So I will just talk a little bit more about Marx's own thinking and the transformation of his own thinking that it underwent. And then we will leave him at the kind of close of his life as he's engaged in this research of indigenous societies and non-capitalist societies. And then we'll turn to thinking Marx from a set of concepts from the Māori world. And the primary one of those is whakapapa. So I will spend some time detailing what that concept is, what it means, so we can get a sense of how from the perspective of that concept we can to an extent rethink Marx. So in Marx's earlier thinking, rather than later than the young Marx, but the Marx of the Communist Manifesto, albeit this is a political text and it's written for a specific reason, and it's but there's a kind of a teleology in there, or there's a kind of attitude towards a notion of progress, which in a sense still kind of ranks the world's societies according to their development. We can find the kind of origins of this thinking in Adam Smith and the physiocrats, but what's sometimes called the stadial theory of history, or the 4 stages theory of history. And the 4 stages theory of history shows that there's a kind of linear trajectory of civilizational development that moves from hunter-gatherer through agricultural societies. But the important point is that these people, these thinkers, felt European civilization to be at the kind of apex of a linear trajectory of progress, which meant that everyone else, all the world's kind of other peoples, were in a sort of prehistory, waiting to attain the full development of capitalist market society. And Marx quite famously adds a fifth stage to this, which is communism. So that transcending this, what Adam Smith and the physiocrats thought was the final stage of human development, capitalist market society. Marx thought that this would be transformed, turning the productive forces towards social ends, abolishing private property and so on, would enter into a fifth stage communism. But it's still quite tied to this relatively linear idea of progress. The book that's kind of crucial for sort of following the story of how Marx complexifies this understanding, transforms this understanding into a much less kind of linear model, is Marx at the Margins by Kevin Anderson. I believe Marcelo Musto, who has also spoken at one of these, he also has a book on these last years of Marx's life, which I'm less familiar with. But certainly Kevin Anderson's book, Marx at the Margins, traces a kind of a marginal Marx. Marx is marginal in two senses. One, it's not his fully completed economic works such as Capital. It's a whole range of other texts. So his journalism, unpublished kind of notebooks where he's thinking things through, his kind of political letter writing with Engels and so on. So there's one sense in which this kind of Marx is marginal to his main works, and the other is that it's Marx's kind of thinking of the margins of capitalism. So the capitalism's outsides as in the process of its expansion. So the kind of orthodoxy that arises from this Marx we briefly discussed from the Communist Manifesto is that in order for people to attain communism, they must pass through capitalism in order to get there, in order to follow these stages along. But it's in this period that I'm focused on in regard to indigenous societies where Marx, to understand what is taking place in Russia, I'm thinking around 1881, he's taught himself Russian. He's reading. He develops a kind of voluminous library about Russia, and a young communist called Vera Vasilich sends him a letter, and her question is whether the rural communes in Russia can provide a basis for communism, or if young radicals like herself simply have to sit around and kind of count the days till Russia has been through this capitalistic process first, transformation first. Marx spends quite a lot of time on his response. He drafts four different versions of the letter and sends a shorter version, but I think all of them are preserved. And his answer is that absolutely, that for him the rural communes are the fulcrum, crucial to Russian, will be crucial to Russian communism. And because they exist contemporaneously with capitalism in capitalist societies, they will be able to kind of jump frog this kind of capitalist phase by simply absorbing the technologies from existing capitalist societies. Funnily enough, this is seen as a kind of heretical stance by the Russian Marxists, So they hide the letter and refuse to let it come out. But there's other places, other the Russian edition of Capital and the French one and stuff, where this argument is kind of integrated. We have here for Marx this very different than his own earlier thinking concept, where this kind of this sort of heterogeneity of structure and motion around the world can enable these kind of conjunctures that can enable kind of leaps into this process. So it's also in this period where he becomes, he focuses his researches onto existing Indigenous societies. So other authors have seen him here spiraling back to the concerns of his kind of Paris youth, the young Marx, this quite dazzling sort of expansive thought. The more orthodox kind of interpreters of Marx after his death thought that his interest in Indigenous societies was, they put it down to senility. He was just too old to be doing the proper scientific socialist work of Capital. So they wrote these kind of writings off. But I think importantly for other people, there's something else going on here. So Marx has given up on this kind of abstract, generic notion of the human, and is profoundly interested. His most voluminous notes are on Native American societies. Become profoundly interested in other modes of life, other kind of other forms of relating to each other in the earth, and that he sees these as being kind of filled with the kind of vitality, lacking the kind of alienation of capitalist societies. He sees them as being in many ways superior to capitalist societies in terms of the phrase, the kind of sensuous wealth of a lived kind of reality that's not alienated by capital. So think here we can think with Marx of these kind of incredibly sophisticated social technologies, democratic structures, for want of a better word, but ways of preserving both independence and interdependence. We can look to these advanced kind of social technologies of Indigenous peoples as providing a kind of a resource for how we think this task of the society to come. How we rethink, how we start to imagine the kind of lineaments of communist society, that these existing indigenous social relations have something to offer here. So it's here we're kind of summarizing quite quickly the article itself. I'm sure Hugh will share it, but it's freely available and goes into greater detail on this kind of history of Marxist thinking. But I'll turn here to start kind of doing the work of thinking Marx from an Indigenous perspective. As I said in the kind of introductory remarks, that kind of the crucial term here, crucial concept with which we can start this task is that of whakapapa. So whakapapa is perhaps the most fundamental, foundational kind of term for the Māori world, for thinking in the Māori world. It's a term that provides it's kind of how the world has its being in becoming, and also a structure for kind of knowledge about that world. So in order that we can have a kind of understanding of this concept to begin kind of rethinking Marx, I'll just kind of give a very bare bones kind of outline of what the concept of whakapapa entails. It's often wrongly translated to mean genealogy, and this is an aspect of it, but it's certainly a much more expansive concept than this. So these images I have there on the slide, it's this a patterning that is related to whakapapa that you will find all through Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, and Māori thinking. So these are double spirals, and the double spiral is expressive of the fact of the kind of origins of the cosmos. So everything in the Māori world, everything that is or has been is part of a cosmic whānau or family that issues from the primordial parents, the intercourse of the primordial parents, Papatuanuku, Earth Mother, infinite foundation, rock of an infinite foundation, the Earth, we can translate here, and Rakinui, who is the Sky Father. So when we're trying to understand what whakapapa means, we can think of two axes of the term. The whakapapa can mean to lay flat, to build a foundation, to place in layers. This is the kind of horizontal axis, which shows a kind of holistic relationship of all things with each other, because everything is descended, everything in existence and different types of things, thoughts, plants, humans, share their descent from the primordial parents, Raki and Papa. Then this is why existence is part of a kind of vast cosmological kind of whānau. So this is the horizontal axis in which everything is related to everything else. And then the vertical axis is a kind of layering of intergenerational descent of the world, constantly being refreshed, reproduced, reborn. So all entities, plants, humans, thoughts, emotions emerge through cyclical increase and development that is shares the same patterning with the creation of the universe itself. And working from the other direction, a knowledge of the whakapapa of creation is itself drawn from close observation and communion with the cycles of the earth, of day and night, the seasons, as well as the cycles of birth and growth. And I will just, so I can. So this image, painting by Robin Kahukiwa, symbolizes here or visualizes Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, can see lying there. But this flag, which you might also have seen, is the Te Tino Rangatiratanga flag, Māori sovereignty flag. It's often just called the Māori flag. But this is likewise expressive of the same story of whakapapa. So generally, in the Māori account of creation, there's lots of regional variations to the story, but I'm just giving you a kind of the kind of basic outlines of the story. But generally, the account begins with te kore, also called te kore kore. So te kore is like nothingness, but it's also like this kind of incredibly pregnant nothingness. Can be understood as the kind of fullness of chaos, and it's another kind of metaphor for te kore is the unfertilized womb. You have this kind of nothingness that is also this kind of fullness and potentiality. That's te kore. And from te kore emerges te pō, the long night of te pō. So this moving from non-being in te kore kore into becoming, non-being to becoming in this what is a kind of night. And it's in this night where a number of beings are born and gestate, beginning with Raki and Papa, Earth Mother and Sky Father, and they go on to have a number of children. Those children are frustrated at the tightness of their embrace. It's too dark and cramped, so they conspire to separate their kind of parents apart. And this is the movement from becoming into the world of being, the world of light, the world of kind of knowledge, te ao marama, kind of Māori enlightenment. Let's see here. So you can see from this flag this kind of process of the emergence from nothingness into becoming, and then birth into te ao marama, our world, the kind of world of light. And so it's through this, through our descent from this process that we are in a cosmological whānau with everything in existence. So it's a kind of relational ontology in which everything has a connection to everything else, and it lacks this kind of distinction that will arrive with Europeans of nature as a kind of object, and a human as a kind of subject that acts against this, kind of subdues, dominates a kind of inert objective kind of nature. So this is a very kind of different conception to this, where humans belong to the earth and kind of are the earth as well, rather than this kind of separation of subject and object, human versus kind of nature. So I think in trying to hopefully you have at least some sense of this notion of whakapapa, this kind of interrelational web of existence that connects everything to everything else. This is the way in which te ao Māori has its being and becoming before the arrival of capitalism. It seeks to impose, to kind of sever these connections and place its own kind of way of operating over that. So in terms of trying to connect this up with Marx, and sort of coming to the kind of end of the things I would like to say, but I'm trying to kind of dramatize this process for us. So using these foundational kind of stories of the origins of the cosmos in te ao Māori, that also brings with it a kind of description of the world, of trying to see what becomes of Raki and Papa, with the arrival of this other character, Monsieur Le Capital, as Marx calls him in Capital Volume 3. So this is here quoting Marx. He says, capital profit, or better still, capital interest, land, ground rent, labour wages. This economic trinity is the connection between the components of value and wealth in general and its sources, completes the mystification of the capitalist mode of production, the reification of social relations, and the immediate coalescence of the material relations of production with their historical and social specificity. The bewitched, distorted, and upside-down world haunted by Monsieur Le Capital and Madame La Terre, capital and the earth, who are at the same time social characters and mere things. So the kind of question here is to ask what becomes of Raki and Papa with this, that Monsieur Le Capital, capitalism, has this parasitic relationship on the earth, uses it as for its inputs for the production process, as dumping ground for its waste. It impoverishes the earth. So the earth becomes the right, this is quoting Marx again, the right of proprietors to exploit the earth's surface, the bowels of the earth, the air, and thereby the maintenance and development of life. So capitalism forces a kind of nuptial with Papatuanuku, with the earth, and then conducts this kind of, operates this exploitative process which destroys the earth of which we are part. So it destroys us at the same time. So the question here, I'm thinking of the earth as sort of proletarian as well. So being degraded, impoverished, kind of forced to provide this kind of basis for production, but in a very degraded kind of sense, and that each cycle demands more from the earth than is able to be replenished for the next round. So it's a kind of indebtedness as well. And the question then to think of ourselves as part of the kind of ensemble powers of the earth. So how does the kind of earth rise up to heave Monsieur Le Capital off to destroy this kind of machinery of our impoverishment, desecration, destruction of the earth and ourselves. So it's an attempt to think from our kind of deep connection to the earth, from our relationships to everything, to everyone and everything around us, and how we might imagine this kind of process of liberating ourselves as at the same time as liberating the earth from this process of destruction, exploitation, degradation. So I think if that's okay, that was about sort of where it might be useful to turn to questions. Hugh?
Thank you, Simon. And yes, I would like to ask any of our audience members whether they had any questions at all. And before that, I'd like to ask a few of my own questions regarding this as well. And so, yeah, my first question is with regards to Marx's letter to Vera and his general research into indigenous societies in general. So I have not read much about this, and because the materials are quite voluminous and there's quite a lot of it to read. And I would like to ask you whether such conceptions, are they grounded in like a genuine curiosity and nuanced treatment in regards to the indigenous societies, or do they kind of veer a little bit too far towards the noble savage myth? So what do you think about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think at this stage of Marxist thinking, like the type of notes he's taking, he's interested in just such a fine-grained detail of social practices. The notes he takes are incredibly kind of he's limited by the anthropology he can read, but he regularly it's not Morgan is perhaps the thinker that he's reading that he respects the most. I've forgotten the name of one of the other anthropologists he's reading, or ethnologists, but he's quite cutting and scathing of that author whenever they try and impose this kind of schema of superiority onto Indigenous peoples. And I think it's kind of it seems relatively free of this kind of sense of the noble savage in these writings. I think the kind of term that will have been used earlier of this and becomes quite a fashion within left anthropology, but of primitive communism, so that these people are seen as an earlier stage of communist society. I think there's certainly some noble savage stuff in that, rather than, but Marx seems to understand in his notes that these are contemporary societies, as contemporary as anything else, and that they have these kind of it's an encounter of his thinking with something outside of that, and he seems to be relatively freed of these kind of problems of romanticism that other authors have.
Thank you so much, Simon. And Sandeep has sent us a question. I would like to read it out loud just for the sake of accessibility. Hi, good morning, all of you. I am from India. I would like to know a little bit about concept of Tikanga and whether it is opposed to ideas of capitalism, especially with regards to the concept of land ownership. And sorry for not being able to pronounce that. Yeah, Tikanga. Yeah.
I just seeing if I can see that in the chat. I just missed that. I missed that word. Sorry. Oh yeah. Okay. I just gonna. Yeah. Yeah. Kaitiakitanga. No, it's a really good question. So I think one of the so kaitiaki tanga means kind of caretaker, guardian. So understand ourselves as caring for the earth, as kind of looking after it. But what I hadn't realized myself until recently is that it's a relatively recent construction, that word, I think in the 1980s. Not because it didn't exist beforehand, but there hadn't been a need for a word that explained this. Because this kind of relationship of belonging to the earth comes, and being the earth comes with it, this kind of ethics of caring for the earth. So it's a word that was specifically kind of created to capture this thing that previously didn't need any explanation. But I think, yeah, and at least for me, that our roles as kaitiaki, this imperative that we care for the earth, means is absolutely capitalism is absolutely incompatible with healthy kind of flourishing earth and people. So I think our role of kaitiaki certainly places us in direct antagonism with capitalism. I think in terms of land ownership, it's again it's kind of this conversion into land as private property. Its conversion into an exchange value is part of the process of its desecration, despoilment, and so on. The conversion of the earth from this living entity into a kind of static sort of value that can be exploited. So I think again, land ownership is also kind of alien to a Māori understanding. There's more belonging to the earth. There's also an authority over land, which kind of grows out of belonging to the land, but it's fundamentally different than a capitalistic form of property ownership, of absolute alienation. It allows you then to do whatever with your property to treat it in whichever way you kind of see fit, because it's been absolutely kind of alienated into your purchase through purchase. Sandeep, does that sort of make some sense? Does that get
Thank you, Sandeep.
Cool.
Thank you, Sandeep, for the question. And while I'm waiting for other participants to provide perhaps a few questions. Oh, Sandeep.
Yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. I liked it really. I also would like to comment that these ideas are so very related to the ideas of Hindu religion as well. The idea about religion and all. They're very connected, it seems.
Yeah, someone was telling me when I was in Vietnam, someone was telling me the story of how one of the gods got the elephant head. What's his name? Actually have so the elephant god, I forget his name, but there was
it's Ganesh.
Yeah, the story of his parents and stuff. I thought that there's some interesting kind of commonalities with Māori stories of creation and stuff. I thought it was really there are lots of kind of connections there.
Yes, thank you for your answer.
No, cheers. Thanks for your question.
Yes, we have another question from Ning Da, and I'll read them out loud for all of us to hear. As we reflect on past and current socialist/communist practices on a national level, how are such practices in these nations, i.e. North Korea, China, Vietnam, how can they be critically examined through the Marxist framework or the Māori Marxist framework? So I think Ning is trying to ask whether the actual practices of actually existing socialisms, how can they be examined through the lens of what you just described?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's really good question. I mean, in some ways, this is quite a specific thinking to this place that has something to contribute, but would necessarily in North Korea, China, Vietnam, other thinkings emerge. So it's really how do we connect these thinkings. One of the I think kind of things is good to point to is I think it's something like Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the world's population, but about 80% of forest biodiversity is in Indigenous lands, and we often find Indigenous peoples at the kind of forefront of struggles to protect the earth and so on. So I think there's undoubtedly a kind of Indigenous knowledges in terms of how to care for the environment that are crucial to everyone. in terms of yeah, I think in terms of the examination of other kind of questions, I think that a Māori Marx is quite specific to struggle here. So, but it comes with the kind of demand that we develop and strengthen and build these kind of really robust internationalisms, where I think the thinking that emerges from these places as well can be placed into dialogue with the Māori Marx, so that we can learn from each other, support each other in our struggles and so on. And beyond that, I mean, I think it's this question of thinking, maybe what can offer to these struggles is thinking of ourselves as fundamentally part of the earth, connected to the earth, and understanding that the destruction of the planet is also the destruction of ourselves. It's a fundamental theft from ourselves and the generations to come, robbing the kind of life of the planet from us. So when we're organizing to think about these struggles as intertwined.
Thank you so much, Simon, and I hope that answers your question. And yeah, I would just while we wait for another question, I would like to ask Simon one more question. Okay, so we've mostly talked about the conception of Māori Marx and its implications in conceptualizing the relationship between the human world and the natural world in general. But I'd like to ask whether this perspective, how does it supplement like potential future socialist policies? So how does the interconnectedness between humans and socialist society, how can that be realized? Because I think in future socialist societies, the exploitation, or rather the extraction of resources from nature, is pretty much inevitable, right? The question is to which degree will it be exploited? So I'm just wondering whether Māori Marx provides any potential insights into this, how we can responsibly use natural resources. And I think a broader question is that how did Maori people treat nature, treat the exploitation or the extraction of resources from nature? And can such practices inform our future socialist societies?
Yeah, fantastic question. I think it's sort of two parts to my answer, but in the kind of normal telling of it, when Māori first came to these islands from elsewhere in the Pacific, there was some relatively kind of destructive behaviors towards the land. Certain animals were hunted to extinction and so on, and food sources were overused and destroyed. But this led to a kind of ecological turn within Māori thinking, whereas so there's no particular issue, or certainly no kind of what do you say, that we, of course, we have to kind of use the Earth's resources for our own kind of maintenance and development and stuff. But it really becomes, after this period within Māori thinking, this need to care for resources, to treat them with respect, and to ensure that they are able to continue their kind of reproductive processes, so that you can have a kind of a kind of fullness and flourishing of these certain resources that work with their kind of use, like attention to sustainable use. think one, I mean, the problem really, capitalism, because it makes possible this infinite accumulation, this notion of that, I don't know, if you have a whole bunch of watermelon or something, you kind of have to eat them or use them, or they will either rot, or you can have a kind of festival where they're destroyed or something. But money makes possible this kind of notion of infinite accumulation, and capitalism has this its drive, and its very kind of kernel of its being. It has to be constantly expanding. So it's really, I think, about destroying this kind of system of value, and it's here where like other ways of thinking and valuing and so on outside of capitalist value will become kind of crucial to maintaining the kind of life force of our own existences and our kind of environments as well. So ways of living that enable the kind of health and flourishing of ourselves and the land where we live. I think the other side of that is in terms of the kind of social relationships that Indigenous peoples have often quite advanced technologies for mediating differences, for bringing people into the group, for settling disputes and so on. So I think here there's and a kind of profound, again, it's not, it's for want of a better word, but profound kind of democratic impulse to them. So it's these kind of things which I think are useful for the struggle and imagining, you know, a world beyond this one.
Thank you, Simon, for the answer. And yeah, I'm just awaiting other questions from the audience. I saw that Grant has just gotten in. Unfortunately, we are almost at the end of our webinar. And so, yeah, if no one else, oh, that's a lot. There's Ning Dak's question. I'd like to read it out loud. As I engage more with Indigenous communities in Canada, I come to a realization that for some First Nations here, they sometimes need to compromise to an extent with capitalist enterprises such as oil and gas companies to ensure economic survival. From the standpoint of Māori Marx, how can Indigenous communities around the world navigate this trade-off, and how can non-Indigenous individuals be more mindful of this trade-off while collaborating with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, absolutely. No, here, much the same as Canada. There's, I think, the context that we Indigenous peoples live inside of a world like everyone else, dominated by capital. And so, of course, there are moments of you know, necessary compromise. There's also moments of kind of the transformation of Indigenous forms of organization into more capitalist kind of forms. So the kind of the iwi here, or the tribe and the tribal governance structures, through the kind of process of redress or seeking redress, have sometimes are converted into something that looks a lot more like a capitalist corporation and things. But within Indigenous knowledges and ways of being, there's still a memory and a connection to these other ways of being, whether or not they can be fully expressed, and often, you know, there's no kind of position of absolute pre-capitalistic kind of purity. So it's a contemporary struggle of drawing on these resources of our carrying these kind of memories of these other ways of existing. That takes place in certainly in struggle with with capitalism, and also often the need for Indigenous peoples to work to try and lift themselves, their people, out of poverty that has been imposed by colonization, theft of lands, and imposition of capitalism. So I think in working with communities, it's just being kind of conscious of these kind of tensions and antagonisms, and the contemporary nature of Indigenous peoples, rather than seeking some and the entire kind of range of political opinions, really. So rather, you can't expect a kind of untainted or a kind of pure leftism, but it's always strategic kind of battles and trade-offs and things like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ning, for the question. And I think we have time for like 1 or 2 more questions and answers before we wrap up at around 3:10 or 3:15. Okay. While we're waiting for some more questions, I think I'll begin with another one of my own personal questions. And so I think your points regarding social technologies is absolutely crucial in today's struggle, because there's, I think, a crisis in leftist organizing circles as to whether to go back to the mass-based cadre party, Leninist kind of model of a party, or should the model of organization be like a more horizontal, more egalitarian mode of organizing? So I'm just wondering whether your insights on the social technologies, how can it help indigenous social technologies, how can it help us to resolve this kind of conflict, or what particular insights does it provide to modern mass movements for workers' rights and for socialism?
Yeah, indeed. So a lot of the well, there's quite a few accounts of early settlers arriving here who are just sort of stunned with how egalitarian and democratic Māori social kind of structures are. So I think the kind of for us here at the moment, the struggle, or the key struggle, is to do with constitutional transformation. So rather than this kind of primary move is to have political authority kind of returned, and this would involve in the sort of some of the paths that have been outlined. It would have 2 kind of spheres: the crown sphere, where the settler kind of state would make decisions for settlers, and then a Māori sphere of authority that would have its power sort of more based in the traditional structures of the hapu as the kind of sub-tribe, and so on. I think in terms of this kind of organizational structures, that they're quite quite decentralized, but have these kind of ways of settling disputes. I think, I mean, I know it's a little bit difficult to kind of suggest, but the form of the marae is millennia old kind of technology, but the forecourt for meetings of hosts and guests, and these kind of deliberative structures that they make possible. So again, there's kind of places for airing grievance, of having discussion and debate, and reaching kind of consensus sort of decision making. But I do think that the relatively kind of decentralized structure of Māori social organizations has been a kind of real strength, and that the state has been unable to deal with a kind of single structure or tactic or kind of viewpoint, And so there's been this own kind of heterogeneity that is preserved through these kind of political structures.
Thank you so much, Simon. And Sandeep has just made a comment by attributing personhood and legal status to rivers and forests. Can this be considered reclaiming lost political and cultural spaces? Can such actions be considered in terms of a world position in Gramsci's conception? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really important kind of progress that has been made in terms of attributing kind of legal personhood. I think they kind of issue from a particular kind of legal block. So whereas the state cannot return. I'm getting a little confused. What does sort of where I think these kind of advances are limited is they still kind of draw things in to this whole other form. Like it's still the form of kind of legal personhood, which is a form that grows out of the ownership of private property, and certainly corporations can have legal personhood, and they do kind of terrible things. Like I don't think ultimately it's a kind of strong enough protection against exploitation of these places. So I think it's really it's an advance in a legal sense, and it does offer protections and things like this. But I think it's falls short of a full kind of transformation of our relationship to those places that is outside of the language of private property and European law.
Thank you, Simon, for the answer. And there's Grant's question. Okay, I think this will be our last question. And if anyone would like to ask Simon a few more questions, I think they can contact him to his official Ōtākou email account, if you would like. Okay, so Grant's final question will be, speaking of constitutional transformation, a key reference in Aotearoa is a document known as the Mātikemai Report. It assumes that the Westminster model as the political structure for Tangata Tiriti, which I feel is a weakness, although, to be fair, that question was not the focus of the report. Nonetheless, it appears extremely fruitful, including for organizing models outside of its focus on national governance. I would like to know your views on the report.
Yeah, cheers, Grant. The Mātikemai report has been massively kind of influential on my own kind of thinking and political orientation and stuff. And I agree. I think on the rangatira sphere side, I think this is fundamentally kind of different to the Westminster model. But as you say, on this Crown side. And so I think, I mean, I'm Māori and Pākehā, so thinking on both sides, but I think really Mātikemai leaves that Crown sphere as a challenge to Pākehā. It's for Pākehā to discuss is that how we want to be governed? Is that the kind of organizational form that suits us? I mean, even, it would seem to me that a kind of Republican sort of conversation would be quite necessary for us to have there as well, rather being tied to the Crown, whether or not Pākehā would want to reimagine their own kind of structures of governance, and in doing that can learn a lot, I think, from the rangatira tanga sphere, the Māori sphere, and those kind of processes. So I agree that it's that's something that remains to be thought and discussed.
Thank you, Simon. And now, and if anyone else would like to ask further questions, please feel free to email either me, and I may perhaps try to relay your questions back to Simon. And you can also contact Simon directly if it is okay for you.
Yeah,
Simon.
absolutely. No, please, you find my find my email on the university page, and yeah, always happy to respond to questions and talk about ideas.
Fantastic, Simon. And now we are at the end of our webinar, and we will be uploading this video onto YouTube in short order, I think in a few days. Thank you so much for participating, and that will be the end of our talk.